morning, everyone. I'm going to introduce myself a little bit. I'm going to tell you two things that you need to know about me, if you don't already. And one is that I've been farming for a while. I dropped out of Brandeis University when I was a junior in 1975 and started farming in a suburb there where we still have a community farm. So I have that background of growing vegetables, and I co-own a farm with friends out in the western part of the state of Massachusetts where we raise beef cattle and heritage pigs and timber, cut timber and that. So I'm telling you that so you know that I have a long history and dedication to the kind of work we do at the Land Institute and the sustainable agricultural movement. I believe in this stuff heart and soul. But the second part of my character is that I'm an academic. I'm an environmental historian. I study the history of farming and forests in New England, and I am by nature and by profession intensely skeptical, which is what you have to be a good scholar, and you have to be particularly skeptical of your own fondest beliefs, which we, I think, heard a little bit about yesterday. So you need to know those two things about me. I have a modest title for my remarks here, Envisioning the Future of Rural America. Yeah, and I added a subtitle, Making Links with Urban Farmers, Consumers, and Citizens. And I'm going to do this by giving you a bit of an update on stuff I've talked about here at the Prairie Festival before about the visioning process, visioning we've been going through in New England, and how that might apply to the rest of the country, particularly as a springboard for the big topic that's on my mind, and maybe yours, and it came up a little bit yesterday, which is how we resettle the countryside. What kind of investment that takes, how we get people to do that, which is what we've been talking about for a long time. So in New England, we've been going through on several different ways a sort of visioning process, a conservation visioning process about the future of the region. And the people who are involved in the forest part of this started in 2010 with a publication called Wildlands and Woodlands. That was out of Harvard Forest. And then a bunch of other scholars that I was also part of on the agricultural side in 2014 published the New England Food Vision, which looks at how much food we could grow there and what good that would do us. And then just on Tuesday, we released a combined one, Wildlands and Woodlands, Farmlands and Communities, Envisioning the Future of New England. So I'm going to just tell you a little about these things as kind of a regional look at what could be done. The Wildlands and Woodlands, the forest vision sets the natural framework. New England is 80% forested today. We called for over the next 50 years that 70% of that be permanently protected, 10% of the protected land in wild reserves, but the rest in sustainably managed forests to produce timber and all the rest of that, the woodland side. And the forest delivers a wide range of a spectrum from the city out to the countryside of great social and environmental benefits that include water quality, carbon sequestration, habitat for biodiversity, recreational, spiritual connection, and renewable wood products. And in particular, this is a great way to sequester carbon. When you compare building with wood to building with concrete and steel, it's an amazing difference in terms of the energy and carbon that's required to produce the stuff. And you can now build some really big buildings out of wood. There's a new classroom building at the University of Massachusetts that's 4 stories high. You can go much beyond that with cross-laminated timbers. This is a really coming kind of thing. And it builds jobs in rural areas, and rural New England and Maine has just lost its pulp industry. It needs a new sustainable kind of rural industry on the forest side. Then given that natural framework, the food people asked, okay, how much food could we grow in this region, and what benefits would that deliver? Because everyone talks about local food, and that's what I mean about being skeptical of your own beliefs. But gee whiz, I mean, New England, to give you an idea, the 6 states of New England, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts in the south, and Maine, Vermont, and New Hampshire in the north, that's about the same area, a little less actually than the state of Kansas. But there's 15 million people there, which is 5 times the state of Kansas. The amount of farmland there today is 5% of the landscape, 2 million acres. You can find that much farmland in 5 Kansas counties. Take any 5. So we're talking about not much farmland for a whole lot of people. We're not going to grow all our own food in New England. So what could we grow? Well, we calculated that if we actually cleared a little forest, leaving that framework, but I had a little room to cut a few trees, 4 million acres, and we could grow about half of our food. We currently in New England produce about 10–12% of our food, but we could do half of it. And let me tell you what it would be, because that's important, because food is not just food, it's different kinds of stuff. Vegetables do not take a lot of acreage. We could grow all of our vegetables in New England. There's some seasonality issues, but basically the acreage is there to do that, and there's enormous social and environmental benefits and health benefits from growing vegetables locally. As Catherine Sneed was talking about yesterday, it's a way to empower people, connect them with what they eat, do it on a small scale. Urban and suburban areas can do a lot of this. So that's a great thing to grow locally. Fruits, we could grow more of our fruit in New England. We've lost a lot of that in the past century to places like the state of Washington that have irrigated acreage. I don't know how much longer we're going to have that. We could grow about half of our fruit reasonably. The other half of the fruit that Americans eat is bananas and orange juice and tropical kinds of stuff, and there's a good case to be made for continuing to do that and have that kind of 50-50 split there. And then the big kicker is dairy and beef. New England has great pasture land. We got rain, we have good soils for pasture. We currently produce about half of our dairy products, but it's only partly on grass and alfalfa. It's lots on corn silage and in feed that's bought in. If we put it all on grass and did all of it, that would take up the rest of that farmland that I just told you about. It would be a healthier way for the cows, healthier for us, healthier for the environment, sequester carbon, as Tim was talking about yesterday, because it's perennial. The beef, we could do all that if we cut our beef consumption, which we probably should. And that's it. You're out of acres. I mean, you can increase the grain production within that a little bit, and there's almost no grain production in New England, and do some of the nice local malting and artisanal baking and so forth, which is good. We can't come anywhere near growing all of our grain in a place like New England. We don't have the cropland for it. We don't really have the right weather for it. To tell you the truth, there's no value in it. If you have limited cropland, you're not going to waste it on wheat. Honestly, just run the numbers. And the same thing applies to places like the state of New York and the rest of the Northeast. That ratio, there's 8 million acres of farmland in New York, but there's 20 million people. These parts of the country can grow more of their grain locally and do some great things, don't get me wrong, but the feed grain particularly, but also the grain wheat has to come from someplace else here. It has to come from the Midwest. So the bottom line is we can grow half our food in New England, we can't grow the other half. We have to be half local and half global. And actually, Angus gave a great talk about this about 20 years ago. Remember, Angus, about the cosmopolitan side with right in this barn around 1996. And that's a good thing to be. We do not want to be all local and parochial. We want to be connected to the rest of the world and ask the same kinds of questions about social justice and sustainability with the places we interact with, as well as with our local landscape. These visions, for conservationists, these visions are incredibly anthropocentric. They are very, very people-centered. But they're also bio-inclusive. So those biological values are there, woven through them and surrounding them. So you start with a set of strong values, social values, health and justice, basically. You build the community infrastructure around those, the transportation, the housing, the health, the rest of that stuff, the energy, and then through and around it is the natural infrastructure. That's the way these visions are constructed. And there's places for wildness within that as well. So we've been thinking about how we could do similar kinds of visioning processes for other parts of the country in conversation with one another to look at this thing from different angles, because it's radically different out here, the kinds of answers that you would get. So this analysis says the Northeast is still going to need grain and oils and meat from the Midwest. So what would it look like in Kansas? Now, Kansas can produce all its fruits and vegetables, in one county. Basically what Wes was talking about yesterday as he grew up in the Kaw Valley, that would do it. So what about the rest of the state? It's still going to be growing grain and meat for the nation. So the issue then is how you do that. And if that's more a grass-based approach to the meat, and if that's a grain approach that takes the livestock out of the feedlots, puts them back on the farms where they belong, gets those pastures going in rotations with hay that keeps the manure there, and then we start to bring in the perennial polycultures for the grains and oils, you've got a vision for the future of a place like Kansas or Iowa. And because the Northeast has sacrificed a little forest to grow more pasture and grow more food, you have room out here to rebuild that natural infrastructure. More riparian kinds of floodplain forests, wetlands, sloughs, tallgrass prairie, bring in some of that wildness as well. California, I mean, if California is facing water scarcity in the future, they've got to ration their water and agriculture better. What could they be producing that New England or the Northeast can't produce? Instead of replacing our vegetable production, as they did 100 years ago, there's things they can grow there that we need or that we want. So that I think every region could take a similar kind of look at this. And in conversation with one another, we could have these visions put together. And we're actively thinking about how we'd set up a process to do that. I want to stress again that the idea here is not that every locality or region should become self-sufficient. That's just the wrong premise to start with. If you start with that premise, you end up advocating mass migration and starvation. When we all used to eat locally centuries ago, you had a famine every few years. We do not want that. So the issue is, how do you take a look at the place where you are, become more self-reliant in places where that makes sense, and retain exporting and importing natural kinds of products that also make sense to do and make those sorts of links. But it's all around a core set of social and ecological values that include food as a right, not a privilege, healthier eating, and we calculate this food vision based on a healthy diet, a generally healthy diet, more fruits, more vegetables, so forth. Universal health care, affordable housing, a living wage, good stewardship of nature, and biodiversity in wild places. That's a set of values that these things can all be built around. Now I want to finish off with just some thoughts about how this might be accomplished. To care for woodlands, farmlands, and fisheries in this way is going to require resettlement of the countryside by farmers and other people who work on the land who hold these kinds of progressive values. And let me stress, that's not a large percentage of the population. You're talking about a back to the land movement, but it's a couple % of the people. It's just more farmers than we've got out here now who can take that kind of care and deliver those kinds of values, because the purpose of farming in this conception is not just to grow the food or cut the wood or whatever it might be. It's to make the world a nice place to live. It's to produce attractive landscapes where other people want to live, in contrast to the agriculture we have today that poisons everything around it and drives everybody away. That's what we're talking about, and that's what we should be rewarding farmers for doing. Not get all hung up on, my God, how can we pay them enough for their asparagus so that they can survive? We got to pay them something for that work. But what about all the other stuff they're producing if they do it right? The water quality, the carbon sequestration, the biodiversity habitat, the beauty of the landscape. That's what we ought to be organizing ourselves to reward farmers for producing, and we ought to be enabling to do that. Not saying you just got to make it on the price of asparagus and compete with some that's grown on some, vast industrialized farm. So, we've been promoting this idea, and the philanthropists and foundations and impact investors and all those great people, they always ask you, well, we want metrics, how is this working? So, this experiment has been run, actually, and it's been run in a little place called Vermont. Vermont is a very small place. It's the smallest state in the country in population. There's 600,000 people, one congressional district. Very rural. Burlington, the capital, has 40,000 people. It's smaller than Salina. Okay? About the same size. In the 1970s, 35,000 hippies moved to Vermont. And look at it today. It's the most progressive state in the country. Bernie Sanders launched his career as mayor of Burlington. This experiment has been run. I mean, I have a farm in western Massachusetts in the Pioneer Valley, and up in the Berkshires, that's a more progressive place than Boston. And that's partly, not entirely, I don't want to oversimplify this, because a bunch of people went there and they stayed. They did not all give up and go. They might have gone to Burlington, and they became social workers and local businessmen, and some of them are still farmers, and they're all on town boards and state commissions, and they're running the place. And they're putting a certain kind of people in the Senate of the United States of America, which is the important point of all this, is that it has a political as well as economic dimension. So our 35,000 people went to a rural, beautiful congressional district in, let's say, Pennsylvania, or Michigan, or Wisconsin, right? So do the math here. There are rural districts out there that have been neatly gerrymandered for repossession. There's nobody out there, and they're in the most beautiful places you can imagine. They got woodlands, they got farmlands, they got brook trout, they got the whole thing. You put a few farmers out there, support them well, and then you get the farm-to-table restaurants and the little summer theaters and the brew pubs and the hard cider stuff and all the rest of this. And honest to God, you take a while, but in the meanwhile, good things are happening, and you've got a kind of transformation in the countryside. I mean, if we're not talking about that, what are we talking about? Okay? And once you've got the constituency in the countryside, then you've got the political clout, because look, progressive values are not going to succeed in this country with just an urban constituency. The country isn't set up that way, politically. So we need this in the countryside so that you can then reinforce all this with the kind of government policies that it needs to reward this kind of behavior and make other kinds of behavior more difficult. That's what government's about, but you have to win elections. And progressive has written off the countryside for 100 years. So that's not so good. But again, it's not just the farmers, it's the landscape they create, and then it's the connection to the people who've got to support them. The people who are joining CSAs ought to be buying land, not just paying for an annual share, but let's buy 1,000 acres out there, put it in some kind of co-op, hire a few farmers to run it with a nice 30-year lease, so they don't have to worry about sinking all their money into their land and then having to sell that. And their children can't even inherit it, right, without wiping out their retirement. I mean, these are real problems of how you get access to land for young farmers who want to go out there and do good things with it and support them so they have a fighting chance of succeeding. That's what this is about. So that's what we're thinking about. This is going to require a massive investment of private capital in land, with people who want to work for conservation values, want to work with land trusts to protect it, and want to create that kind of a world. That's kind of what I had to say. Severin, I think, will be addressing some of these ideas later on this morning, so I'm looking forward to that. That's it. You have any questions? Simple. Let's go do it. And I ate up 10 minutes. We're back on time. What is that, my entire assignment? Cool. Any questions? There are some things. Mary. No, hopeful, not optimistic, please. Oh, thanks, Mary. Oh, yeah. Yes. But what I'm also thinking is that when you're saying the CSA people should buy land, is that called financial sequestration? There's an idea. Is public banking and other forms like that? Financial sequestration. Did everyone hear that? Okay, so we talk a lot about carbon sequestration. So you're putting all this wealth of carbon, taking it away from where it's doing damage in the atmosphere, putting it in the soil where it's organic matter and does good. And she suggested if people buy land for these kinds of purposes, we could call that financial sequestration. What's that? Yeah, well, so there's a practical, buy land. I mean, that's always, Pete Farrell.
Right, I completely support talking with you about this. I know the private capital is there. Severin leads thousands, if not millions, of people who would like to go to that. Here's the issue that I confront, is that we have an entrenched financial and political system that absolutely doesn't want this to happen.
Oh, yeah, that's,
And
of course.
So I've been up against that, and it's intimidating. And I don't have a good question here even. But then, I mean, we need help from policymakers, and we don't have any control over that right now.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I'm giving a jaunty little Sunday morning talk. This is lifetime slogging stuff. That there's going to be a lot of losses, a lot of difficulties. There's going to be a lot of tension in the countryside, obviously. If people come in like this is a fraught kind of thing. I don't mean to be like we can just waltz out and do it, but I mean, there it is. Yes, sir.
Have you and your collaborators thought a little bit about how a universal basic income or restructuring or changing subsidies would impact this vision?
I have thought about that, but as I think it through, it seems to me that unless a miracle happens, it's difficult to see how you get the policy ahead of the constituency. So I come back to a political question about, okay, given the world as it is, they got to be ratcheted along together. So you get little pieces of the Farm Bill to help with this. You get places that pass a living wage. I mean, you chip away at it. But I don't want to be in a place where all these other political things have to happen before this becomes possible. I want to say, okay, there are a lot of liberal, progressive people who've got quite a bit of money, and is there a way that they can utilize that in maybe some very focused ways? And see, exurbanization is going to keep happening anyway. People are going to be moving to the countryside, so the issue is, are they going to chop it up and fragment it into pieces that make it harder to work that landscape, or can it be done in a new kind of way, and where you can start building into that process, okay, that's a gentrification process, so how do we build in affordable housing to that maybe utilizes local wood, and so there on the local level there might be a policy change where, you're going to build elderly housing, but it's going to use local timbers. It's kind of a long-winded answer just to say these things have to work along together. Vic?
I love the fact you mentioned Vermont.
Why not?
Because my oldest son is a young farmer in Vermont growing rice.
Rice.
You haven't even thought about it, maybe. But there's a crop that could get great expansion in Vermont and provide local food and would not be a grain crop. It would be grown something on land you would be growing grain. So,
What kind of land is he growing rice on? Because it's a grain in my book.
Well, but it's not wheat land.
Oh, yeah.
When you talk about people
So it's,
grain, right?
yeah,
Wheat, oats, whatever.
good cropland.
Yeah, rice is a different
Yeah.
animal. It's land you should be growing wheat on. And they work.
Right. So there are other wrinkles to this, and I don't mean to completely denigrate growing grain in a place like New England. I've grown grain. I grow winter rye all the time, right? I break out a few acres of pasture every year. I plant pumpkins and squash. I throw down winter rye, and then I replant pasture in the spring. I mud it in. So I could, they're a little local combine. We could grow a little bit of grain in that rotation, and it wouldn't have cost me a thing, really. And so there's plenty of niche room to expand things like this that do local vegetable oils. And and grains. I'm not trying to say that's all crazy. I think it is crazy to think we could feed all of the Northeast on grain that's grown right in that region. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, you did mention briefly in passing something about winning elections.
Yeah.
And while I think all of us support the hundreds of things individuals, communities, neighborhoods can do, I keep coming back to winning elections, which I should say in November of 2016, I think a lot of us felt, gosh, we didn't win, and I can't believe that the majority of Americans are actually in favor of the direction that Congress and the administration seem to go. And I get a little nuts that some of the most idealistic people in the country, 7 million of them voted for a third-party candidate who's
Yeah, well, I don't think it's a slam dunk. I mean, I just think that, and people are going to keep voting for third parties and vote the way they're going to vote. And some of the people who are already living in rural areas, when they see this wave of young farmers coming at them, are going to think that's great, and some are going to feel invaded. And so I guess it's just not simple. But I would just like to shift the balance and take advantage of this kind of opportunity. Some people who are large donors to political parties who want to win elections, and that's what they have on their minds, might compare the efficacy of what I've just suggested to throwing money away, all their money away on TV ads. And in the meantime, might get something done. So I think there are people who are concerned mainly with political consequences, who could look at this kind of broad visioning stuff strategically and say, aha, there's a place where even on a shorter time framework, we might be able to make a large difference, and, you know, there you go. Sure.
Okay, skeptical question.
Great.
Going back to your Vermont example, and tell me if I misheard this, but it sounded like the solution to a lot of the rural problems in Vermont was for urban progressive hippies to come and migrate and colonize the state and muscle aside the rural folks that were in political.
Well, I don't know that in political sense, yes.
So that sounds like a recipe for a lot of social conflict.
I think so.
And probably the existing residents wouldn't be too happy about that.
Probably not. But
Did I hear this right?
you heard this right. I think, but I'll tell you something else. A lot of the locals in Vermont got along pretty well with these young folks who came in. And once they saw that, even if they didn't know what the hell they were doing, they were willing to work and had some spunk. They're like, well, maybe these kids can learn something. And there's, people doing their dissertations on this in Maine. There's a lot of interesting interplay between the old timers in those places and the new folks coming in. And to me, that's up to the people who are moving. People are moving to other parts of this country all the time. And someone's going to be moving up there anyway into these rural places and owning land. And I'm just saying, here's a bunch of people that might want to do that. And it's up to them to learn how to get along with neighbors and have these conversations and not behave like total idiots, but still, Anyway, I'm sorry if there are more questions, but we have to keep moving on here. So that was the last question. Thank you all very much. And yeah.